And greetings. This is Jeff Long, also known as Tironan in the world of warplanes, and I'm doing something radically different today. This is my take on the Battle of Waterloo, and I should say the campaign of Waterloo, the things that led up to it, and the things that often get ignored to English-speaking audiences. And the reason for that is a legacy of one-sided histories by British historians, for lack of a better term. And it's not recent, but a backlog of it done over the preceding 20th century. And it's not unusual, by the way, folks. If you go and you read a careful history of the War of 1812 and you choose your average book in the 1930s, 1940s, even as late as the 1950s, you would have swore up and down we won that thing. There was American heroism all over the place, and it was the greatest thing since fried cheese and the Bears. Yeah, it was that bad, all right? And so do not think for a moment that Great Britain was alone in this. But there are a lot of English boosters out there, and there have been some god-awful liberties taken with the Waterloo campaign, especially in movies. I don't know if any of you ever saw the Dino De Laurentiis Waterloo movie. Gets a lot right from the English perspective, but just kind of leaves out an awful lot that would have been expensive to do in the first place, and you're selling to an English audience in the second place, and, you know, let's be real. But it's not true history. It's pandering to an audience. It's always bothered me. And like every other kid growing up, and you take an interest in military history, and I did. I read that, and then I began to run across David Hamilton Williams, who some people absolutely despise, and the whole series of authors began to bring up some things that were just flat ugly. And things that took place. I edited on a Wikipedia and caught just 9 kinds of hell from a couple of authors who just didn't want that sort of stuff in their Battle of Waterloo whatsoever, and the Prussian participation in it wasn't mentioned at all. And looking at the 200th anniversary of Waterloo, you got a bunch of English-speaking guys, and I don't know what their historical credentials were, but it was more of the same crap. And where they hadn't mentioned the Prussians, they did so, they may have given them 10, 15 seconds, maybe a minute, which, yeah. Folks, at most, this battle lasted from 7.5 hours, and the Prussians are there for about 40% of it. So that alone tells you it was probably a lot longer than you wanted to. So we're going to step back in history a little bit to 1814, and this is where things began to fall apart for Napoleon. He had gone on the Russian campaign in 1812 and proceeded to take 600,000 men across the border and came back with about 23,000. Now, a lot of those guys, I don't care what anybody tells you, never got that far over the border and began to desert and start filtering their way back to their respective home countries because not everybody came from France. They didn't bring 675,000 Frenchmen. Okay, and there were Prussians in there who walked in and came out pretty much intact. There were Austrians on the southern flank that went in and left pretty much intact. But the main army went in at 400,000 strong, and I'm sure that all those guys just deserted early and successfully and decided to start drifting back across the border and making their way back to whatever country they came from. All of those guys made it back. But a lot of Napoleon's army was just destroyed en masse. And they did not die the way that people want to talk about. They died primarily from a disease called typhus. Typhoid? Typhus. Rickettsida is how it's actually the name of the bacteria. And it's transmitted by the human louse. And people did not understand how it worked. Food was lousy. People were marching all day. Water was bad. And when you start reading the descriptions, I read a article that entire book on Rickettsida and how it worked. And it was known as the jail disease. Anywhere that lice would essentially go, it killed an awful lot of people. And it killed on both sides, but it was really prevalent among the French because they didn't get enough food, they didn't get enough water, they didn't get... it was one of the primary killers, actually. A lot of things that were reported as people starving to death or freezing to death was typhus, taking them out. So in any case, down... He came back with his armor pretty well shattered, and the War of the Sixth Coalition started. And he was doing pretty good, won a couple of victories at Lutzen, Bautzen, and then a smashing victory at Dresden, and things were looking bad for the Allies. But a couple of things were working against him, too. He didn't have the fabulous cavalry that I'm bad about that one, too, by the way, that he started the war with. No cavalry unit came out with its horses. They were killed and slaughtered for food. It was that bad. And so when they started the 1814 campaign, he had to rebuild his cavalry from scratch. And you know something? It wasn't nearly as good as it used to be. A lot of his forces weren't as good as they used to be. So he wins these victories, boom, boom. After Lutzen and Bautzen, though a couple of things actually became clear. He couldn't finish up like he used to. And before the victories of Austerlitz and Jena and Alderstadt, and he'd had this army that it was strung all along the eastern, western seacoast, preparing to invade Great Britain, and his armies trained and trained and trained. And it showed up. His armies performed brilliantly. Well, in 1814, those armies didn't exist anymore. And a lot of those generals that he counted on to make that happen didn't exist anymore. And one of the outcomes of that was he didn't have cavalry that was so much better than his opponents anymore. And sometimes markedly worse. And he couldn't follow up victories by crushing pursuits anymore. The other side was just as good as marching as he was. The other side had adopted a lot of his tactics. A lot of people understood you couldn't use linear warfare the way that they used to. In other words, his opponents were quite superior to what they were. And so his days of easy victories were over. And so you begin to see the relying more and more of mass as you begin to study Napoleon's battles. But his communications, while good for the time, weren't up to the task, and his generals, a lot of them, for the time, weren't up to the task. Under his personal supervision, where he could send them messages to say, I want you to do this, this, and this, they did pretty good. When they got to independent command, not so good. Well, Lutzen and Bautzen were followed up by a smashing victory at Dresden, and things were looking bad for the Allies. And then came the Battle of Dennowitz and the Battle of the Kosbach. And all the smashing victory that he got out of Denon, out of his win there, just were frittered away by a guy named Ney and a guy named MacDonald. They'll come up later too. Okay. And then came the Battle of Leipzig. and the dark days and the final end of his regime seemed to be at an end. And he won a series of victories, but the problem was Napoleon could only be at one place or another. And as good as he was, there was one of them. And that was just lovely, but he was getting beat everywhere else. And then he started getting beat towards the very end. Finally, his marshals got together and said, "You got to go." Literally, there's a scene in that movie where Ney says, "You have Cossacks watering their horses at the Seine. It's over. You have to abdicate." And he did. Now, France was war-weary as hell, and it wasn't just him. Okay? So we're setting up for the Waterloo campaign here. So you get an idea that this is a guy who had shot his bolt, began with the his invasion of Russia, and ended literally at the gates of Paris. And that would have been the end of him, except for this fellow, King Louis XVIII, who was kind of more of a moderate than he's given credit for, but made some mistakes very early against a very wary French public, and had a whole lot of hardline jackals behind him that really wanted to go back to the France of, 1780. And that France didn't exist anymore. And he managed to alienate his army, which was quite serious. And France harkened very quickly back to dear old Napoleon, who had given them all the victories. In the meantime, this was going on. The Congress of Vienna. And these guys were all congregating, redividing Europe in a very reactionary way, and would set up Europe to be a very conservative, reactionary place overall throughout most of the rest of the century and well into the 1920s anyway, 1920s I would say. And Napoleon came back. He just wasn't ready to quit. A lot of people were telling him how bad things were and how much the people desired to return, and he came back. And this began the 100 Days. So we get to some points here. He reconstitutes his army. Go back to the Congress of Vienna here. These guys decide that what they're really going to do is go out there, and they've had enough of this guy. He has rubbed the nose of Europe in his crap, as far as they're concerned, for far too long, and they are done. And virtually every major power in Europe says, "I got 150,000 men, I'll send them." So, Austria, Austria, Prussia, Britain, Spain, you name it, they were sending troops down. And really gets to Napoleon has to win, and he has to win quick. Now, I'm not going to have any fancy animations, and I'm not going to be standing, I'm an American, I'm not going to be standing on the fields of Waterloo while I tell you this story. But I am going to tell you the truth as it sits. We're just going to use the maps and a timeline. And I hope that's okay. What I am going to give you is a more holistic view of what was actually going on. Because I must have watched 10 videos where you would have thought that Wellington, Quatre Bras, and the Prussians showing up at the last minute to pursue the enemy down the field, off the field, was the way it is. That wasn't the case at all. So let's get to brass tacks. Waterloo was the result of a campaign. It was one of 4 battles that were fought. And they went side by side both times, which is pretty darn rare. The Battle of Waterloo started somewhere between 11 and 12, and nobody to this day is certain of, when it started. Best guess, 11:30 to 12 o'clock would be where I'd think it started. But if you want to nail me to a cross on it, I couldn't swear to even that. I knew that by noon it was well underway, truly on. Anyway, okay, so we have the two battles here. The French are coming from Charleroi. I'm not French, by the way. Maybe mangling the spellings terribly. And Napoleon understood that he had gained a march. And here's to the intelligence section of this. Napoleon gets into Paris, begins to reorganize. Devoe begins to help him. His Minister of War was Devoe in this case, and he had to leave him behind, which for him was a shame. For the rest of Europe, probably not. And he begins to raise armies. Immediately raises the Army du Nord. Of the three armies that day, it was probably the best. And there's areas when you speak of an army and its effectiveness, there's the equipment levels, its training levels, its efficiency, and how it operates on an operational level, which is quite something else. You'll hear young guys go on sometimes about tactics and how if you do this and do that at small units level, how it can really, it's a war-winning strategy. Well, it's not. Okay. I remember reading one book where Patty Griffith was walking me through how the British were dominating the dreaded 300 yards. And that's why the British always won. Well, first off, the British didn't always win. This happened most of the time. Secondly, well, that's nice, and it's probably the least understood part of a battle. Of the three armies, this was the second fastest, the French. And the best disciplined was Wellington's army, in my opinion. You will hear things about allies, but I will tell you that the allies, with one or two units exceptions, were quality troops and behaved like quality troops. Quatre Bras was held because Dutch units refused to be moved. And interesting thing about that battle was even two squadrons of Prussian lancers got separated from the battle at Ligny, ended up at Quatre Bras and fought through the engagement, almost died to a man, but they fought for the British at Quatre Bras. I thought that was pretty interesting. And Wellington, of course, sent down troops down to reinforce it and so forth and so on. This story, has been repeated so many times, I'll kind of hesitate to even go into it too much. But in the meantime, you have this. Well, the reason this happens, instead of Wellington's whole army being concentrated and ready, and you can have these forces, in front of Quatre Bras, where the Prussians and the British can slide up and down this very nice road, which is a rarity in the area. And I'm going to tell you this from the outset, that the road net and lack thereof affects the entire campaign. There is no easy way to get from Wauters to Mont St. Jean. So that's just right up here. Doesn't exist. If you get far enough up this road, you find Mont St. Jean, and it will not be very far. Grenoble is the name of that. And then if you go a little further, you start running into Brussels. In fact, a lot of this area now is a suburb of Brussels. So, but this is a wonderful map of the first days of the battle. The reason that the British weren't here was Wellington was relying on a intelligence network that failed him entirely. And that may have been quite on purpose. He felt like he had been deceived by that intelligence network, and a braggart named Falk was probably very involved in it. But he's one of those guys that told so many lies he didn't know where the truth is, and so nobody can really ascertain whether he was a central character in it or not, but he was certainly involved in deceiving Napoleon. The Prussians, not having that network, decided to set up a whole lot of postal checkpoints. And they literally ran it all the way down to close to Charleroi as they got to get away with, and began to pick up hints of French movements very early, and began to transmit them to Wellington as well as to their upper command. And the guy most in charge of that was a guy named Ziethen, and Perch II. So they were not taken unaware. They began to gather their army, and things were going just fine, except this guy named Blücher. So you say, not Blücher, but Bülow, right here. The guy, remember when I showed you that Battle of Denowitz? Well, the guy on the losing side was a guy named Ney, the guy that lost up here, and a guy named Bülow. And he got some help from another fellow who was the king of Sweden, Prince of Sweden at the time, soon to be the future king of Sweden. He showed up on the French flank and proceeded to slaughter the poor bastard. Anyway, getting back to this. So you're moving up here, and the Prussians started advancing, and the message either couldn't find its way forward, the guy got the message too late, or the guy was kind of being deliberately dense. I've heard 3 stories. I don't know which is true, but regardless, he did not get there in time. Okay, so the Prussians are where they're supposed to be. They're in front of this road they need to be on. That allows them, and put a lot of effort into keeping this road open so that the British allies could get to them. Because Blücher and Wellington talked and said, yeah, if I don't get attacked, I'll show up. Caused a lot of hard feelings later, because Guys now, Blücher's chief of staff, really thought they'd been betrayed by Wellington. Wellington had just flat made awful mistakes here. Very well dispersed, which is how you want to be when you're not getting ready to actually battle. Makes it easier for the troops to buy from local farmers and merchants and what have you. Spreads the pain and spreads the wealth of the army spending real money to buy this stuff, and you don't exhaust the local area. So he wasn't being stupid, but he just got deceived. Couldn't get his act together quick enough to be where he wanted to be. And where he wanted to be was here, strung out with the Prussians. And together, you're talking quite a few troops. 105,000 with these guys that all got their act together, more like 80,000 because Blücher didn't show up. Here, they fought with about 30,000. And I don't know about you, but if I'm facing the true number that he could have brought down, which would be about 78,000 troops, it gets ugly in a hurry, doesn't it? Such is war. Okay, so we have the Battle of Ligny, and this probably goes a long way to the Prussians weren't fooled. And this guy, Ziethen, actually goes, and he's right here at this area. He's all the way down here, and he fights a running battle all the way to here where he joins the rest of the army. And I will tell you, of all the things that you do in the military as an army, a fighting, organized retreat is one of the toughest things you'll ever be asked to do. Did it all day long. This battle didn't start until 3 o'clock because of this guy. Right there. All right. And mistakes were made. You've heard things about, troops being exposed on the forward slopes, and that's why they got slaughtered. But that's crap. There were lots of mistakes made, but that wasn't one of them. Not real sure what that's about. I don't know what it was said, but there's no proof, and no other general mentioned that. So I don't believe it. Anyway, they fight and fight and fight, and I have some maps on this. Let's see here. This is one of the best ones. Doesn't give you the units, but it does tell you that these areas here were central, and this is the area that finally got assaulted by the old guard. This is where Napoleon was when he was watching the battle. He had a windmill with a tower, and they were strung up in an area, Second Corps, First Corps, Third Corps. This area was so swampy that it should have been held very lightly, if at all. First Corps had been fighting all day, and Clausewitz was probably the most damning. A guy named Clausewitz actually was there as the operational officer of the Third Corps, and so he saw the battle. Wrote a little treatise called On War, which became, and is to this day, one of the major treatises that is still studied by major war colleges by various armies around the world. And he said that help was asked for too quickly, granted way too often. We exhausted ourselves long before we had to. Also, Blucher made a huge mistake that he was trying to take forces from here, swing them around the left, and crush the French, about the same time that the old guard came in and smashed Ligny. And the shame of it is, let's see if I've got another better map here. Probably don't. Bulow was coming. If he had hung on for a few more hours, Bulow would have been there, and he would have held out throughout the day, and you have a radically different battle. But that's not the only weird thing I had here. You have Tironan, Excelmann's Corps. I heard it called various things, but Tironan was the general in charge of the Corps, who marches between Area 1 and Area 2, and never manages to join either battle, when his presence on either battlefield would have swung it radically in both ways. So we have the case of the Battle of the Missing Forces. Bulow, Tironan. And neither one of them has an excuse for not contributing to something. If he had shown up here, he would have crushed them at Quatre Bras, because there weren't enough forces to stop 66,000 men. If he'd shown up here, they would have crushed the Prussian right, chased them off the battlefield. Had this guy show up, and this guy continued to do this movement, it would have been a reverse. He would have simply crushed the French left, and that would have been all she wrote. So it's a very strange battle in that regard. And it gets stranger. Let's go back here, because this one shows it best. They broke through the Prussian center with the guard here. And so, in a typical Napoleonic fashion, what we want to do is pursue these guys to the end of the earth, grind them under our hooves, and trample them under our boots, and never get out of a pursuit until you completely destroyed the army, just like you did in Austerlitz and you did in Jena and Alderstadt. And here we didn't do that. Here we did not do that. We sat on our butts. I'm talking as if I were the French army as a whole. Of course, it's ridiculous, but it illustrates the point. The French army then proceeds to act like we beat them, they'll go away, and sits. And there were some reasons for that. This area, for instance, had been fought and lost and won 5 times. Changed hands 5 times in one battle. These areas were very hard fought over. Okay? And any attempt to take this had gotten very rough treatment from the Prussians, who then retreat here. Any attempt to get near them, again, very rough treatment. I mean, you don't want to guess how much damage was done. And I guess that they decided at this point, we're just going to leave them alone. Relax, had a hard day. There's no other really good explanation. But historians throughout time have wondered about this. And it has an ugly consequence. Because this battle was a defeat for the Prussians, but it isn't a very serious defeat. If you use the figures given, this is another area of ambiguity. The Prussians lost somewhere around 12,000 killed and wounded, and you never know what that means. Of course, the dead aren't rising. We don't have any zombie armies, so you don't have to worry about that. If it says KIA, they're pretty much killed in action. They're not coming back. But wounded, a lot of the wounded, even in these times, would be back in action the next day. And it's the same with the French. And our army's under a lot of stress, so I don't trust their muster reports that much. So don't know. The British win their argument over here with Ney, thanks to this fellow. And it's kind of interesting. Ney becomes quite the villain here, though throughout most of the Battle of Waterloo, he was actually within arm reach of Napoleon, who knew everything he was doing. So one of the things I will tell you to watch out for in your histories of Waterloo is that Napoleon looks for scapegoats. Okay? He did it with Grouchy here. He does it with Ney. Okay, so we'll move on here, and let's see if I've got a good picture of this battlefield. There we go. Okay. No, it's not the perfect picture. So, the Prussians get beat here at Ligny. Not all that serious. And a lot of it has to do with the French just, for one reason or another, couldn't really seem to push the Prussians around all that badly. The Prussians retreat up to Wavre. And a lot of the reason they stopped at Wavre was because that's where some of the Prussian troops stopped running at. Okay, I'm not anybody's friend here. I'm not pro-Prussian, I'm not pro-French, I'm certainly not pro-British. I just want the truth out for once. So they retreat up here, and Gneisenau, Blücher actually got run over by cavalry leading a charge. At 72 years old, the man's leading cavalry charges. Give you an idea just what a firebrand he was. Wasn't the brightest guy in the world, but by God, he could lead his troop in this fire like nobody's business, and Gneisenau did most of the thinking. Anyway, Blücher eventually shows up, and he is as old school as you get. He told Wellington he would come to his assistance. And from Gneisenau's look, he said, they promised to come over here. The British were going to help us out. We could have smashed through the French. Why did we give battle? And why did we keep our flank hanging open? The only one that came near that flank was Tironan and his troops. When damn near got crashed, now we're going to trust them and show up at Waterloo. Well, Blücher, being Blücher, said, I gave my word, and that's the end of the discussion, and they got ugly. But at the end of the day, they agreed, and they began to move. So, how bad was the laxity of the French in this? There were park trains full of logistics, bridging equipment, siege equipment that just got up and leisurely moved out at 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning. While the French sat there absolutely unconcerned. They move up here within 48 hours. They're up in this area. The second mistake, and it was huge, was that Napoleon heads up after Wellington and the Anglo-Allied Army. I call it Anglo-Allied because most of the troops, it was really a confederation of troops. It wasn't just British troops here. Stop at Mont St. Jean, deploy in their positions, and enjoy a very wet night the day after the battle, and start fighting the next morning. 48 hours between these battles and these battles. Napoleon leaves Grouchy here. 33,000 men, and it's mostly infantry, and he's infantry poor. He comes up here with an army that is mostly, has very heavily weighted in heavy cavalry and artillery, and he comes in infantry light. Prussians are in here reorganizing, and they are started reorganizing because, remember I talked about operational level? Operational level has to do with the overall performance of the army. How well does it move? How well is its logistics trained? How well can it perform its operations as a mass and as a whole? I'm not talking tactics. I'm not talking training of individual troops or even units. I'm talking its ability to move, resupply, reorganize, and of the three armies, it is the best at that. It did such a spectacular job here that at war colleges around the world with various armies, it is still held up as a shining example of what a general staff school can do for an army. They kicked their entire supply line out of the way of the French on the fly, to send it up to their supply officers, who immediately know what to do because they all came from the same general staff college. There were 4 or 5 of them, but they all were teaching the same curriculum. Immediately established a new line 20 miles north or so, maybe 10. And the army continues to function. As it's marching from a defeat, it reorganizes itself. By the time it gets up here in Mouvert and the morning, the day after the defeat, the morning, they were defeated that night, and 48 hours later, that morning, they were marching, reorganized, and to Waterloo. There are 4 corps here. First corps under Thielman, second under Perch, third under, first corps under Zeithen, I'm sorry. The second is under Perch, third is under a guy named Thielman, fourth under Bülow. First thing in the morning, Bülow starts marching off. Now, do yourself a favor and go to Google Maps, look up Waterloo, look up Mouvert, and go to satellite view, and you will see to this day there is no good road beyond a little 2-lane farm to market road type things there, and what was there in this time was mud tracks. Bülow takes off. They has a number of things holding up. First, a fire breaks out. Then they run across this really crummy bridge that is broken down, and they have to go repair it before they can pass over it. Needless to say, take off first thing in the morning. They don't show up till 4 o'clock that afternoon. It takes them 8 hours. 8 hours to go that miserable short distance over those muddy trails. Zeithen takes a little more northern route, the Bois d'Ohain road here. It's close to the Bois de Paris road here. And they're showing these as roads, and they're barely qualify as such. And it's at this part they start having a major issue. The French are already engaged. They have been engaged since, take your pick, somewhere between 11 and 12. And it begins with the attack on Hougoumont. Hey Saint, the Grand Battery begins to attack here and begins to do the first attack. You get the, and I've actually got a timeline that I've put together that to give you an idea of what was actually going on. And we'll be on this map for the rest of the video. All right. About 1300, 1 o'clock, the major attack by a Tironan, and this goes on for some 3 hours before it's said and done. 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Okay. At 13:30, 30 minutes after this attack begins, Napoleon sees Prussian columns coming. They're 3 hours away, and he's far too inexperienced a general. He could tell almost to the minute from a column or coming into sight how long it will be, and he gets it almost to the minute. He knows he's in trouble. He has a reserve, and reserves matter now more than anything. Also at 13:30, the Battle of Waterloo takes place. Remember how we left our buddy Grouchy back here? Let's see if I get to the right. There you go. Grouchy is following up this line, and it's an interesting tale. He begins to follow it up. He's talking to shopkeepers. They speak French. He knows the area very well. And some things become apparent to him very quickly, that the Prussians are planning to join Wellington at the earliest moment. And they brag to shopkeepers, they aren't really beaten, by God, they're going, and it does not sound like a dispirited army. And he starts sending the information, including a signed requisition sheet from a Prussian officer back to Wellington. Hey, here's all the stuff I'm finding. These guys are coming. He gets told to engage these guys no less than 3 times. Keep your sword pressed to their back. And the Tironan, several generals actually pushed Grouchy to march to the sound of the gun. This is the biggest load of crap out there. He had no way to get there once he'd been left on this battlefield. Okay. It takes the Prussian army 8 hours to get there. It would have taken Grouchy 8 hours to get there. And every available track is now covered by the Prussian army moving. Anywhere that he attempted to go would have run into a Prussian corps, and they would have fought there, and the other 3 Prussian corps would have just gone around him. He had 0 chance of getting to Waterloo in time. Was not going to happen. So, and anyway, his orders told him at 2 o'clock, at 4 o'clock, and at 6 o'clock to get there, and then finally, very late in the day, it's going to be, you need to rush to me as quickly as possible, and the only way to him is through the Prussian Third Corps. A guy named Thielmann with Clausewitz holding his general staff position, his general staff officer. Okay. Napoleon sealed his fate, in my opinion, and it's just my opinion. Other people have very strong opinions on this, when he left Grouchy on that battlefield to follow up with the Prussians. There was nothing in that road network that was going to support his actions. Allow him to get there. Okay. So, by 1:30, the battle has begun for Waverre, about 2.5 hours to 1.5 hours after the Battle of Waterloo starts. This battle will go on till 10 o'clock the next day. Grouchy is that out of the loop. It takes 6.5 hours to get an order from Napoleon's command to Grouchy. That never changes. All right, so that happens. Another damning fact, while we're talking about it, after the Battle of Ligny, Grouchy's forces would not take off after the Prussians until 2:30 the next day. It was way too late. Okay, so now we got the fact where Exelman, or Tironan, is attacking Picton in the center. Everybody knows that story. You've heard it 50 million times. The guy, Tironan, comes up, these big massive formations. The heavy cavalry comes in, just crushes it. and then gets crushed in return. Um, and that goes on until 4 o'clock. Best I can figure out here. What I'm trying to give you is a more complete picture here, by the way. Okay, so what happens at 4 o'clock? Well, Buell and the 4th Corps were found here, and they sent Lobaw off here, and they meet in this area, Fishermont. And they are pushed all the way down this road until they end up in Pleasanton. Now, he is tore up because Buell went after him, and he has Blucher riding his back, and Chief of Staff Ganais now, and they are in a fury. As you can imagine, they have had the French on their necks for year after year after year, and they have had enough of Napoleon, his empire, and they mean to end this today. They get down here, and they fight, and he's getting pushed out. 30 minutes later, 4:30, Zython shows up. And this has major impacts, because by the time he shows up, the first attack's been defeated. Heavy cavalry has come in, tore them up, got torn up in return, retreats. And then the cavalry attacks start. Okay? And they don't have a whole lot of success. But it isolates the French, or the French cavalry attacks isolate the British squares up here. Nobody's having a good time. It goes on and on and on and on. Wellington's trapped inside of a square while this is going on. He's lost total contact with the rest of his army. This goes on for a while. Zython shows up. And things are getting dicey. Okay? The hole in the center is getting very rough. Zython shows up here. And these become very crucial. And Zython links up with the British left, and Wellington is able to start yanking units from his left and start reinforcing his center with these troops. Zython goes on the attack and takes Lochay, Papinet, Fishermont. There's a division commanded by Duret, and that French division is outnumbered 3 or 4 to 1. Okay, they are just, and so this whole area now is covered by Zython. And that begins at 4:30. Meantime, Buell is driving down here. And the French position, one of the things that infuriates me the most, they show these two armies like they were there in isolation. Well, this is what the battlefield looked like. This area from here all the way here is bent in a horseshoe now. A very narrow horseshoe. And it's going right along this line. Okay? And things are getting, Tironan is is not holding on. Is actually being hammered fairly badly. Tironan's being stretched within an inch of his life. And there are still Prussians entering this field. The French second attack takes place after the main cavalry attack, about 6,500 troops, and it's a mixed attack, and it has a lot more success, and things are still dicey here. But the bells begin to toll. Zython continues to push, starts at 4:30. This is going to all end at 7:30. And the reason is this. You cannot, Lobau can't hold them. So Napoleon begins to throw the entire Young Guard in there, who wins back Plassano. He's being driven out, Lobau is being driven out of Plassano. throws in the Young Guard, who recaptures it, and the Prussians come back and take it again. Then he throws in a couple of Old Guard battalions behind it, and that's only, it ends up with a total of 5 Old Middle Guard being tossed in here. No, they weren't the only, British weren't the only one facing the Old Guard that day. I believe the units attacking the British units were actually Middle Guard. So total of 5 battalions of Old Guard strung out, a couple in support. 2 go in here, 1 goes into a wooded area right here. This is the area that turns out to be key for this. Napoleon's already light in infantry. He's got 33,000 people trapped on the other side of the Dye River at Waverloo, who are never going to arrive in time. But he misses them now. This area is threadbare. Tironan is just eaten up alive by his current commitments. Picton's dead, but his subordinate's doing just fine, and things are getting strained. Ziethen is now pushing, and Duret's in deep trouble. Within 3 hours, this entire area is going to collapse. La Haye, Papenet, Fischermont is going to crush. He's going to literally crush and send them fleeing from the battlefield. And the time's already ticking, and there are no reserves. This is going to get to sound like a broken record. The last reserves are the Old Guard, who attack. And now is one of the stranger things that you will ever hear in history. There are 3 areas of the line. They all fall within minutes of each other, and I don't know which one is first. I'm going to take the guess, and it is a guess, that this area fell first. But, and I take that from a number of reasons. It is the number of accounts of the disruption of this entire area of the French line. Okay? Because he's got these areas lined up, and Ziethen begins to pound them with artillery from the flank. And if there's an area you never ever want to take fire from, it's on the flank from artillery units. And it causes disruption all up and down the entire French right. British left. And he's got virtually every cannon he's got is up here pounding the hell out of Tironan. He releases his cavalry, which begins to flood right down the backside. And this is the only line of retreat the French got, and the Prussians are in the middle of Pasano, pushing through at the same time, and the Imperial Guard is coming through. Okay, things are just so vicious in here, it hardly bears description. The Prussians and the French are in there, and just put it nicely, they don't like each other even a little bit. Any French unit that did not rout out of this never got out, period. And it was on both sides. Okay, they would not ask for nor receive quarter. 96% of the Young Guard died here. Lobau's division ceased to exist in this area. The French attack, you've heard that story how many times, get shaken up, thrown back by various units, including Dutch. And Maitland's guards and the Wellington orders to counterattack. They come crushing through here. Ziethen is pouring through here. And down here, the Second Corps shows up and proceeds to hustle and bustle the Old Guard unit in this wood out at bayonet point. Now, these are 2 very old line infantry regiments that have been around since before the Napoleonic Wars started. And they were just not impressed by Old Guard. They considered themselves the The elite of the elite, I don't care what anybody said, and they acted like it. Promptly threw them out. The other two French regiments are thrown out here, and they run into the British countercharge and can't fire. It becomes a rout. Four squares form down here and are annihilated, and you know the rest of the story. Okay? That is the Battle of Waterloo. That's the full and complete story. Well, it's not the full and complete story. We'd be here for a week, wouldn't we? But it's a nice encapsulation of what actually happened. Okay? I've just seen, if I see one more British video about how, they took everything on, I'm going to throw up. I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know how it's received. There's some other videos I could do. This is the one that's been bugging me for the last 2 centuries, so 2 decades anyway. And let me know what you think. Appreciate you. Have a great day. This is Tironan, and I'm out.